The silence was the first thing Eli Vance always noticed. Not the absence of sound. The apartment hummed with the low thrum of the city beyond its floor-to-ceiling windows, but the absence of life. It was a specific sterile stillness that settled in a space where life had just been violently extinguished. This scene was particularly still. The victim, a wealthy financier named Alistair Finch, lay on a white marble floor that seemed to drink the light from the room. There was no struggle, no chaos, just a single dark crimson bloom spreading from his chest, a stark and brutal flower on the pristine stone. It was meticulous, too meticulous. "Looks like he was posed," Detective Harding muttered, his breath fogging in the chilled air. "Glad you're here, Eli. If there's anything to see, you'll find it." Eli didn't respond. He was already in his own world, a world measured in f-stops and focal lengths. He raised his camera, the cool metal a familiar comfort in his hands. The viewfinder was his shield. Through it, the horror became geometry, the tragedy became texture. He wasn't a man looking at a body. He was a lens capturing data. He worked with a practiced, almost reverent-like calm. The wide shot to establish the room, the medium shot to frame the body in its environment. Then he moved closer. His job was to find the details others missed, the tiny stories hidden in the larger, louder narrative of death. He photographed the victim's hands, the expensive watch on his wrist, the overturned crystal glass nearby. Finally, he focused on the victim's face. Alistair Finch's eyes were open, staring up at the vaulted ceiling with a look of placid surprise. Eli leaned in, his macro lens hungry for detail. He was looking for petechial hemorrhaging, for any sign of a struggle the killer had tried to erase. He adjusted the focus ring, the world blurring until only the man's right eye was sharp. The cornea, a perfect glassy dome, reflected the room back at him in miniature. The window, the lamp, the faint outline of Eli himself. He took the shot. The click of the shutter was the only sound that felt real. Hours later, the world outside Eli's darkroom had faded to black. This was his sanctuary, a place of control where chaos was rendered into order on photographic paper. The faint, sharp scent of developer fluid hung in the air, a scent he associated with truth. He worked his way through the digital files, his movements efficient. Each image was cataloged, tagged, and filed. He reached the macro shots of the victim's face. He was about to discard that one of the eye reflections were notoriously unreliable, often contaminated, but something made him pause. A flicker of pattern in the distorted reflection. He pushed his chair closer to the monitor, his face bathed in its cold light. He zoomed in, the pixels rearranging themselves. The curve of the cornea warped the image into a funhouse mirror version of the room. He almost dismissed it again. It was nothing. It was his mind, exhausted and strained, playing tricks on him. Pareidolia, seeing faces in clouds, or in this case, in the eye of a dead man. But he couldn't let it go. It was the same obsessive nature that made him good at his job. He ran the image through a sharpening filter that adjusted the contrast, deepening the shadows and brightening the highlights. The image resolved, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a pattern. It was a face. A small, round face framed by pigtails. It was smiling. A wide, innocent, gap-toothed smile that he hadn't seen in 15 years. It was Maya. He shot back from the desk as if electrocuted, his chair slamming into the wall behind him. It was impossible. A trick of light, a digital artifact, a projection of his own unending, corrosive guilt. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the image, but it was burned onto the back of his eyelids. Maya smiling. 2 days later, Eli was at another scene. This time, it was an alleyway downtown, slick with rain and smelling of decay. The victim was a night shift security guard, slumped against a graffiti-covered wall. Another observer. The thought came to Eli unbidden. and he pushed it away. He tried to work, to fall back into his routine, but his focus was shattered. He felt a gnawing paranoia, a sense that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long. Every glint of light on wet pavement seemed to resolve into a pair of eyes. He found himself scanning the periphery of his shots, the dark windows of the buildings above, the deep shadows between dumpsters. He was looking for her. Back in the darkroom, his hands trembled as he loaded the memory card. He clicked through the images, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Nothing, just a grim, straightforward homicide. He felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. It had been a hallucination, stress, lack of sleep. Then he came to the last photo, a wide shot to establish the alley's entrance from the street. He almost passed it by, but then he saw it. Standing half hidden behind a concrete support pillar, just at the edge of the frame, was a small figure. It was out of focus, blurred by the rain, but unmistakable. A little girl in a yellow raincoat. He zoomed in. It was Maya, but this time she wasn't smiling. Her face was pale, her expression one of profound, heartbreaking sadness. Her eyes, even blurred, seemed to be staring directly at him, pleading. The dam of Eli's composure broke. He tore through his apartment to a locked footlocker at the bottom of his closet. Inside were the ghosts of his childhood, a collection of photo albums he hadn't opened since the funeral that wasn't a funeral, the memorial for a girl who was simply gone. He spread the photos across his floor, his professional tools now turned upon his own history. He used a photographer's loupe, scanning each image, his breath fogging the plastic. He was looking for anything out of place, any sign he had missed. He found the last photo ever taken of her. It was at the park on that bright, sunny afternoon that had turned so dark. Maya was in the foreground, beaming, holding up a half-eaten ice cream cone. He had taken the picture himself, just moments before he'd turned his back, just moments before she vanished. He had always focused on her face, memorizing every detail of that last smile. He had never truly looked at what was behind her. He scanned the image into his computer, the machine whirring as it digitized his grief. He zoomed in, pushing past the grainy resolution of the old film. He enhanced the background, clarifying the distant tree line, the other families enjoying the day. And then he saw it. Standing near a thick oak tree at the edge of the woods was a figure. It was little more than a smudge, a trick of the deep shadows beneath the canopy. But it was wrong. It was too tall, its limbs too long and thin. It had no discernible features, just a vaguely human-shaped void that seemed to suck the light from the area around it. A tall, distorted shadow. A tremor of ice-cold dread shot through him. He had never seen it before. How could he have never seen it? With a shaking hand, he pulled up the other two files on his monitor. The photo from the financier's apartment. The one from the alleyway. He pushed the contrast to its limits, plunging the images into stark black and white, forcing the hidden shapes to reveal themselves. And there it was. In the deep reflection of the dead man's eye, lurking behind Maya's smiling face, was the same unnaturally tall, thin silhouette. And in the rain-slicked alley, its form was just visible in the darkness of a distant doorway, watching. It hadn't just started. It had been there all along. Maya wasn't the hunter. She was the bait. Sleep offered no escape, only replays of a tall, thin shadow unspooling from the trees. Eli abandoned his bed, fueled by a mixture of terror and a grim newfound purpose. The police precinct's digital archive became his new hunting ground. For 2 days, he mainlined stale coffee and sifted through the ghosts of his own career. His search parameters no longer dictated by procedure, but by a chilling, intuitive pattern. He wasn't just looking at cases. He was looking at victims. A bird watcher found at the bottom of a ravine. A private investigator who'd suffered a fatal accident in his office. a reclusive amateur astronomer who fell from his rooftop observatory. They were all observers, people whose profession or passion was to look. He pulled up the crime scene photos for each one, his eyes scanning the backgrounds, the peripheries, the negative spaces. And in case after case, once he knew what to look for, he found it. A smudge in a window's reflection, a flicker of impossible geometry in the grain of a photograph, a shadow that fell in the wrong direction. It was subtle, almost nothing, but it was there. The entity had been hunting in his city for years, and he had been its unwitting archivist. Find something, Vance? Eli jumped, spinning in his chair. Detective Harding stood behind him, holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. His expression was one of friendly concern, but his eyes were sharp. Just cross-referencing some old files. Cold cases, Eli lied, his voice raspy. He minimized the screen, hiding the gallery of spectral images. You look like hell, Harding said, placing a cup on the desk. Been here all night? Something like that. Don't burn yourself out, Harding advised, his tone softening. Whatever you're looking for, it'll be there tomorrow. Eli watched him walk away, the detective's words echoing with an irony that felt like a physical blow. It'll be there tomorrow. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Harding was right. The entity wasn't going anywhere. The first violation was small. He came home from the precinct to find a single photo from an old case ajou, landscape shot of a desolate highway tacked to the center of his corkboard. He was certain he had filed it away. He chalked it up to exhaustion, a simple lapse in memory. The second was harder to dismiss. He walked into his darkroom, and the air was wrong. It was cold, carrying a faint, ozonic smell like the air after a lightning strike. On his workbench, a fresh sheet of photographic paper lay exposed, ruined. It was milky white, but as he stared, a faint, dark shape began to resolve on its surface, like a developing Polaroid. It was an image of his own bedroom, taken from the corner of the ceiling, looking down on his sleeping form. He snatched the paper, his fingers trembling, and held it under the safe light. The image was undeniable. It was him, vulnerable, oblivious. The entity had been in his room. It had watched him sleep, and then it had created this mockery of his craft. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a taunt. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He stumbled through his apartment, his eyes darting everywhere. He felt its presence now, a static charge in the air, the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes. His home, his sanctuary, was no longer safe. It was a cage, and he was the one being observed. He lunged for a roll of black gaffer tape and began frantically covering every reflective surface, the bathroom mirror, the glass on his framed prints, the dark, glossy screen of his television. If it was watching, he would give it nothing to look through. Eli's world shrank to the 4 walls of his apartment. He stopped answering calls from Harding. The outside world was a sea of potential threats, of reflective surfaces he couldn't control. His focus narrowed to the images on his monitor, the only place where the enemy was visible, however faintly. He began to notice the rules of the engagement. The entity was shy. If he looked for it directly in the photos, scanning the background with intent, it would seem to vanish. The strange smudges would resolve back into normal shadows. The distorted figures would become tricks of the light. But if he focused only on Maya, on her sad, pleading face in the alleyway photo, the presence of the shadow in the periphery would feel stronger, more defined. A terrible understanding began to dawn on him, a piece of instinctual, primal knowledge. The entity fed on attention, but it was a specific kind of attention. Direct observation was a threat, but focused, obsessive observation of its lure, that was nourishment. The first rule solidified in his mind, a desperate piece of self-preservation. Don't look away from Maya, but never, ever look for the thing in the background. It was a razor's edge. He had to stare into the abyss, but he couldn't let the abyss know he was staring back. He was staring at the photo from the alley again, his face inches from the screen. He was trying to decipher the look in Maya's eyes, to understand her warning. He zoomed in, the pixels of her face blurring into a mosaic of color and light. He pushed the sharpness filter, trying to bring her expression into focus. And it changed. It wasn't a subtle shift. It was a sudden, violent transformation. The profound sadness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a stark, wide-eyed terror. Her mouth was no longer a sad line, but a perfect O, a silent, hysterical scream. And her eyes, they were no longer looking at him. They were fixed on a point just over his shoulder, staring into the room behind him. Eli froze, every muscle in his body locking up. The air in the room grew heavy and cold. He could feel it, a solid presence, a weight. He didn't want to turn around. The rule was to not acknowledge it, to not look. But Maya's silent scream was a command. Slowly, his body moving with a stiff, robotic dread, he swiveled his chair around. His apartment was empty. The windows were dark. The taped-over mirrors offered no reflection. For a heartbeat, he felt a surge of relief. Then he saw the door. Carved into the wood, deep and sharp, was a single, long scratch. It started near the top of the door and ran almost to the floor, splintering the varnish. It was fresh. The raw wood inside the gash was pale against the dark stain. It hadn't been there a minute ago. He stared at the mark, his mind refusing to process it. The entity wasn't just in the photos. It wasn't just in his head. It was in his apartment. It was real, and it could touch things. And as he looked at the deep, violent gouge, a second rule, more terrifying than the first, screamed through his mind. What happens when it decides to touch me? The scratch on the door was a declaration of war. Eli spent the rest of the night huddled in his darkroom, the one place that felt remotely defensible, his back pressed against the only door. When his phone buzzed with a call from Harding, he ignored it. But the text that followed made his blood run cold. New scene. 455 Hemlock Drive. You're going to want to see this one, Eli. The victim is Sarah Jennings. Sarah Jennings. The name hit him like a physical blow. She was a local investigative journalist, a bulldog who specialized in cold cases. 5 years ago, she had written a retrospective series on Maya's disappearance. She was the only person in a decade who had treated his sister like more than a statistic. He found himself driving to the scene on autopilot, his mind a maelstrom of dread. Jennings' apartment was a testament to her profession. Walls covered in corkboards, tangled webs of string connecting photos, notes, and newspaper clippings. And in the center of it all, she lay in her office chair, her death looking for all the world like a simple aneurysm. But her eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling with a familiar look of placid horror. As Eli raised his camera, his hands felt like foreign objects. The viewfinder, once a shield, now felt like an invitation. He worked the scene, his movements stiff. He photographed the corkboards, the notes, the cluttered desk. Then he saw it. Tucked into the corner of her main board, almost hidden behind a map of the city, was a recent, candid photo of him, taken from a distance, walking into his apartment building. "Jesus," a voice whispered behind him. It was Ben, a young, eager lab assistant who sometimes helped process his photos. "She was looking into you?" "No," Eli said, his voice a low rasp. "She was looking into my sister." Ben's face softened with dawning recognition. "Wait, you're that Vance? I'm so sorry, man." He looked from the photo of Eli to the wall of cold cases. "Harding said she'd reopened the file on your sister last month. Maybe she found something." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah Jennings wasn't just another observer. She was looking for Maya, and the entity had found her first. The entity was no longer content with the periphery. It was becoming bold, Eli would catch its movement in the polished chrome of his kitchen faucet, a flicker of a tall, spindly silhouette where his own reflection should be. He'd see it in the dark glass of a storefront as he walked by, a faceless figure keeping perfect pace with him, before vanishing when he turned his head. It was a mimic, a predator learning the shape of its prey. The terror of this new development was paralyzing. It led to a new, more frantic rule: don't let it see you looking at it. He had to train his eyes to never linger on a reflective surface, to treat every pane of glass as a potential Judas mirror. His paranoia bled into his work. At the lab, Ben approached him, his expression earnest. "Hey, Eli, I was thinking about that Jennings case. It feels wrong. If you want, I can ... look into her files off the books. See what she found about your sister." Eli's first instinct was to push him away, to warn him. But the offer was a lifeline in the darkness, a chance for an ally. The hope was a more powerful poison than the fear. "Be careful, Ben," was all he could manage to say. That was the last time he saw him alive. The call came 2 days later. A single-car accident on a quiet stretch of road outside the city. Harding was already there, his face grim. Ben's car was crumpled against an old oak tree. Eli approached, his camera feeling like a block of ice in his hands. Ben was still in the driver's seat. His eyes were wide open, staring at the empty passenger seat beside him. There were deep, bloody scratches on his own face, as if he had tried to claw something away. Eli saw the small, blinking red light of a dashboard camera mounted on the windshield. Later, in the silent sanctuary of the lab, Eli watched the footage. The first few minutes were just the dark road, illuminated by the headlights. Then, Ben begins to glance nervously at the passenger seat. He mutters, "Who's there?" His voice trembles. He glances again, and then he screams. It's a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. He claws at his face, wrenching the steering wheel. The final frames are a chaotic blur of green and brown as the car leaves the road. The footage proves it. Ben was not alone in that car. Ben's death shattered what little remained of Eli's resolve. He was a leper, a carrier of a contagion that killed anyone who got too close. He locked himself in his apartment, the world outside a hostile territory. Sleep was impossible. His waking hours were spent in the blue glow of his laptop, diving headfirst into the digital abyss of occult forums, paranormal wikis, and forgotten folklore blogs. He searched for any mention of shadow people, mimics, things that fed on sight. Most of it was fiction, teenage ghost stories. But after hours of digging, he found a fragmented post on a defunct conspiracy forum. The post, written by a user named Cassandra_79, described a legend from an unnamed culture about a Kaios Kolos, the shadow of the observer. It spoke of a parasitic being that existed in the blind spots of the world. It was drawn to those who stared too intently: artists, astronomers, detectives. It had no form of its own, so it coveted ours. The post claimed the being would study its target, learn its shape, and eventually, when it was seen and acknowledged, it would attempt to take its place. The final line of the post was a chilling, fragmented warning. ... It becomes real when you know it is there. To see it is to feed it. To name it is to invite it. Do not look. Do not speak. Do not ... The post cut off, the user never heard from again. Proof. He needed proof. He was a photographer. His entire life was about capturing objective, undeniable truth. The thought was a desperate anchor in a sea of madness. If he could capture an image of it, a real image, then he wasn't crazy. He devised a plan. He took a DSLR camera and mounted it on a tripod in the center of his living room, pointing it toward the couch. He connected it to his laptop, setting up a live feed. He would be the bait. He sat on the couch, his back to the camera, and forced himself to watch the live feed on his screen. For hours, nothing happened. The image of his own back was maddeningly still. The silence in the apartment stretched, becoming taut and thin. He could feel it, though. The familiar pressure, the weight in the air. It was watching him watch himself. Then, on the screen, the space behind his on-screen self began to shimmer, like heat haze off asphalt. Slowly, a form bled into existence. The tall, spindly silhouette of the gaze materialized in the center of the room. It was clearer than ever before, a pillar of absolute blackness. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't move. He just stared at the monitor, at the entity standing silently behind him in the digital reflection. Then, with an unnaturally fluid motion, the thing on the screen slowly turned its smooth, featureless head. It tilted it down, looking directly into the lens of the camera that was capturing it. The laptop screen instantly erupted in a snowstorm of white static. A high-pitched squeal screamed from the speakers. At the exact same moment, the lights in his apartment blew out with a series of sharp pops. The hum of the refrigerator died. The city glow from the window vanished. He was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness and a silence so profound it rang in his ears. The live feed was dead, but he knew, with a certainty that went beyond sight, that he was no longer alone in the room. The darkness was not empty. It was full. It pressed in on Eli from all sides, thick and heavy like black velvet. The sudden, total silence was even worse. The familiar hum of the city, the thrum of the refrigerator, the buzz of electronics, all of it was gone, ripped away, leaving a vacuum that was filled only by the frantic, percussive beat of his own heart. He was frozen in his chair, every muscle screaming at him to run, but his limbs refused to obey. Where would he go? The thing from the screen was in the room with him. He didn't need to see it to know. He could feel its presence as a drop in temperature, a physical weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. It was the chilling stillness of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. He strained his ears, listening past the blood roaring in his head, and then he heard it, a faint, dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement on a windless night. It was the sound of something that shouldn't be there, moving with a purpose that was utterly alien. It was to his left, near the door. Then, a moment later, it was behind him. It was exploring its new cage. Fear was a physical thing, a cold liquid pouring through his veins. His greatest tool, his sight, had been taken from him. He was blind, and he was not alone. He had to move. Staying still was a death sentence. He slid off his chair, his movements agonizingly slow, his bare feet meeting the cold hardwood floor. He needed his phone. It was on the kitchen counter, 10 feet away. It might as well have been a mile. He navigated by memory and touch, one hand outstretched, the other trailing against the wall. The familiar geography of his apartment had become a hostile, unknown landscape. Each step was a gamble. The rustling sound had stopped, which was somehow more terrifying. The silence was expectant. His outstretched hand brushed against something. He flinched back. He waited, listening. Nothing. He reached out again, more slowly. It was his coat rack, a familiar wooden pole. Relief washed over him, brief and fragile. He used it as an anchor, preparing to move around it. His hand slid up the smooth wood, then met the fabric of a coat. And then his fingers brushed against something else. It was cold, colder than fabric, colder than wood. It was a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to suck the warmth from his fingertips. And it was smooth, with the texture of polished stone. He thought for a delirious second it was a sculpture he'd forgotten he owned. His hand explored further, tracing a shape. The curve of a shoulder, the long, elegant line of a neck. And then his fingers brushed against a surface that was perfectly, impossibly smooth. A face with no features, No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a void. He snatched his hand back with a strangled gasp, stumbling backward and crashing into a bookshelf. Books rained down around him in the dark. The entity was real. It was solid. He had touched it. He scrambled away, crab-walking across the floor until his back hit the far wall. He fumbled desperately in his pocket for his keys, his fingers closing around the small metal fob for his car. He clicked the lock button. For a split second, his phone, lying on the kitchen counter, lit up as it received the Bluetooth signal. The flash of light was blinding, but in that instant, he saw the room. It was empty. But on the wall, where the entity had been standing, a patch of crystalline frost was rapidly fading into the damp air, a ghostly stain on the wallpaper. Huddled on the floor, his body trembling, the darkness and the terror worked on him like a chemical solvent, dissolving the scar tissue over his oldest wound. A memory, suppressed for 15 years, flooded back with perfect, horrifying clarity. He's a boy of 12, standing in the park. The sun is warm on his face. He has a new pair of binoculars, and he's just spotted a scarlet tanager, a rare bird for this area, perched high in a tree. It's a flash of brilliant red against the green leaves. He is completely captivated, his world narrowed to the perfect circle of the lenses. Maya, 7 years old, is tugging on his sleeve. Eli, look, the ice cream man is here. In a minute, May, he says, his voice hushed, his eyes glued to the binoculars. Just stay right here. Don't look away. I'll be right back. He takes a few steps closer to the tree, trying to get a clearer view of the bird. He is an observer. Even then, he is lost in the act of looking, of capturing the image in his mind. He forgets everything else. He forgets the ice cream man. He forgets the promise he just made. He forgets his sister. When he finally lowers the binoculars, the bird having flown away, the space behind him where Maya was standing is empty. The weight of that moment, the crushing, absolute gravity of his failure, hit him now as if it had just happened. His guilt wasn't just guilt. It was the truth. He had been distracted. He had told her not to look away while he did exactly that. The gaze hadn't found him randomly in Alistair Finch's apartment. It had been with him that day in the park, drawn to his intense, focused observation. His guilt wasn't just a feeling. It was the anchor that had tethered the entity to him for 15 years. The memory gave him a strange, fatalistic clarity. He was not a random victim. This was a reckoning. He needed a new weapon, a new sense to fight with. His eyes were useless. But his ears. He remembered the old microcassette recorder he kept in his desk drawer, a relic from his brief stint in journalism school. He felt his way to the desk, his hands sweeping across the surface until he found the cool plastic rectangle. He clicked the eject button, fumbled a fresh tape in, and closed the door. He held the small device in his trembling hand. The silence in the room was absolute, watchful. He pressed the red record button. The tiny wheels inside began to turn with a faint whir. He held it up, his voice a dry, cracking whisper that was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Who are you?" He let the tape run for a full minute, recording nothing but the suffocating silence and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then he pressed stop. He rewound the tape, the whirring sound loud in the stillness. He took a deep breath and pressed play. First, there was only the loud hiss of empty tape, the sound of his own breathing, the whisper of his question, tinny and pathetic. Then, more hiss. He was about to turn it off, convinced of his own foolishness. But then, through the static, another sound emerged. A low, guttural whisper, like the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. It was distorted, ancient, and filled with a chilling malevolence. It spoke a single clear word that made the hair on Eli's arms stand on end. Look. The word look echoed not in the air, but in the architecture of Eli's own mind. It was a command, a hook baited with the promise of knowledge and the threat of madness. He knew with primal certainty that to stay in the darkness was to surrender. Action, blind and desperate, took over. He scrambled toward the door, his hands slapping against the wall, searching for the familiar brass of the doorknob. The dry, rustling sound started again, faster this time, circling him. It was a predator herding him, playing with him, his fingers closed around the knob. He twisted, locked the deadbolt. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers slick with sweat. The rustling was right behind him now, the cold spot pressing against his back. He threw the deadbolt, wrenched the door open, and plunged into the relative brightness of the apartment hallway. He didn't look back. He sprinted down the hall, down 3 flights of stairs, and burst out into the cool night air of the city. He ran for 2 blocks without stopping, the sounds of traffic and life a welcome, chaotic symphony that drowned out the memory of the suffocating silence. He finally leaned against a brick wall, gasping for air, his body trembling not from the cold, but from the aftershocks of pure terror. He was out, but he had left everything behind. He was homeless, hunted, and armed with a truth that no one would ever believe. For 2 days, Eli was a ghost in his own city. He drifted through 24-hour diners and rode the subway until dawn, terrified of enclosed spaces, terrified of the dark. The entity was quieter now, but he could still feel its gaze from a distance, a persistent pressure at the back of his neck. He knew it was watching, waiting. His mind kept returning to the fragmented forum post, to Cassandra_79 and the shadow of the observer. It was his only lead. He found a public library, his hands shaking as he typed the username into every search engine he could think of. Hours of digging yielded nothing but dead ends until he cross-referenced the username with old articles about local paranormal investigators. He found it. A single mention in a 20-year-old newspaper article about a poltergeist case. The reporter quoted an Arthur Blackwood, a paranormal researcher who had consulted on the case. The article noted Blackwood's partner and archivist was a woman named Cassandra. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. He found an address for Blackwood, a small, unassuming house in a quiet, older neighborhood. Standing on the porch, the paint peeling under his knuckles, Eli knocked. The sound was deafeningly loud. The door opened a few moments later. The man who stood there was old, perhaps in his late 70s, with a cascade of white hair and pale, sightless eyes that stared at a point just over Eli's shoulder. He was blind. "Can I help you?" the old man asked, his voice a dry, scholarly rasp. I'm looking for Arthur Blackwood," Eli stammered. "I need to talk to him about the shadow of the observer." The old man's face, which had been placid, hardened into a mask of stone. The change was subtle but absolute. He was very still for a moment. "You had better come in," Arthur Blackwood said, stepping back to let him pass. Arthur's house smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and something else ... ozone, the same faint scent from Eli's darkroom. The living room was a fortress of books, shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes. There were no photographs, no mirrors, no reflective surfaces of any kind. "Cassandra is gone," Arthur said, his voice flat as he felt his way to a worn armchair. The gaze, as she called it, took her 17 years ago. She looked too closely for too long. Eli felt a cold knot of dread and vindication. He wasn't crazy. He sat opposite the old man, and for the next hour, the story poured out of him. The photos, Maya, the observers, the mimicry, the voice in the dark. Arthur listened without interruption, his blind eyes fixed on the space around Eli's head. "It is a parasite of perception," Arthur explained when Eli was finished. "It has no substance of its own, only what it can borrow from the attention of others. It is drawn to focus, to obsession, Your guilt over your sister made you a lighthouse in the dark, and your skill as a photographer made you the perfect meal. How do I fight it? Eli asked, his voice cracking with desperation. You cannot fight a shadow with your fists, Arthur said, a faint, almost cruel smile touching his lips. It exists in the negative space, the periphery. It fears one thing above all else, complete observation. To be seen fully, from all angles at once, with no blind spots to hide in. To be brought out of the shadows and into the light would be to define it, to collapse its form. It would destroy it. A new, terrifying strategy began to form in Eli's mind. A photo of everything at once. Precisely, Arthur nodded. A 360-degree, high-resolution image. A picture of everything. There would be no background for it to hide in. You would force it into the frame. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But it will fight you. When you are about to capture it, it will manifest more powerfully than ever before. It will try to make you look at it, to acknowledge it directly. That is its final defense. You must not. You must look through it. You must focus only on the camera, on the act of capture. The plan was insane. It was suicide. But it was also the only path forward. As Eli stood to leave, a surge of gratitude washing over him, he noticed something on the mantelpiece, tucked behind a stack of books. It was a small silver picture frame, turned face down. An instinct he couldn't explain made him reach out and turn it over as he said his goodbyes. The photo was of a younger Arthur and a woman with kind eyes, Cassandra. But what made Eli's blood freeze was Arthur's face. He was younger, but his eyes were wide, clear, and filled with the exact same stark, soul-shattering terror as Ben, Sarah Jennings, and all the other victims. The photo had been taken before he went blind. Eli walked out of Arthur's house. The image of the photograph burned into his mind. He tried to rationalize it. The fear in Arthur's eyes was from his own encounter, before he found a way to win by sacrificing his sight. The advice had to be real. It was the only hope he had. The alternative, that he was being led into a trap, was too terrible to contemplate. He spent the last of his cash at a high-end camera shop. The 360-degree camera was a strange spherical object, its twin lenses like the compound eyes of an insect. It felt alien in his hands, both a weapon and a sacrificial object. Holding it, a cold resolve settled over him. He knew what he had to do. He had to go back to the beginning, back to the place where the first shadow fell, where his guilt was born. He was going back to the park. Dusk was bleeding across the sky as Eli entered the park, staining the clouds in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The cheerful daytime sounds, children's laughter, the jingle of the ice cream truck were long gone, replaced by the lonely sigh of the wind through the trees. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the dry, skittering whisper he'd heard in his apartment. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, to bend at an unnatural angle. This place, once a symbol of his greatest failure, now felt like a battlefield. He walked the familiar path toward the clearing, the strange, insect-like 360-degree camera clutched in his hand like a talisman. Arthur's words echoed in his mind, a mantra of hope and poison. It fears complete observation. You will force it into the frame. But the image of the old man's terrified eyes in the photograph was a dissonant, screaming note beneath the surface. Was this a weapon, or was he the lamb being led to slaughter? At this point, the distinction hardly mattered. It was the only path he had left. He saw the old oak tree, a dark, monstrous silhouette against the fading light. It was the spot from the photograph, the place where the first shadow had fallen. He could feel a change in the air as he approached, a drop in pressure, a thickening of the atmosphere that made it feel like he was walking underwater. The entity knew he was here. The gaze was waiting. He found the exact spot, a small patch of grass where he had last seen Maya, her face bright with a smile that was now a ghostly memory. He extended the legs of the tripod, his movements deliberate and steady, a stark contrast to the frantic chaos churning inside him. He mounted the spherical camera, its twin lenses staring blankly in opposite directions. The moment the camera clicked into place, the world went wrong. It started with the sound. Everything became muffled, distant. The gentle wind died, and the rustling of the leaves ceased. A profound, unnatural silence descended, the same suffocating stillness from his apartment, but magnified in the open air. Then the light began to warp. The last rays of the setting sun seemed to bend, curving around a point directly in front of the tripod as if avoiding it. A space about 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide began to shimmer, not with light, but with its absence. It wasn't a shadow. It was a hole in the world, a vertical column of visual silence that drank the color and detail from everything behind it. It was a blind spot that had taken on a physical form. Trees seen through it appeared distorted and gray. The air around it crackled with a cold, static energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The gaze had manifested. It was more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. It was not a creature in the world. It was a wound on it. The entity was in front of him, a shimmering void, and the psychic assault began. It didn't speak, but a command hammered against the inside of his skull, a silent, deafening scream. Look at me. His instincts, his photographer's soul, everything in him screamed back in agreement. To see it, to document it, to understand it, that was his nature. He felt his head begin to turn, his eyes desperate to focus on the anomaly. Then came the visions. The entity projected them into his mind, illusions made of his own grief. He saw Maya, not as a ghost in a photo, but standing right there, her hand outstretched. Look, Eli, she whispered, her voice filled with tears. Look at what it did to me. He saw Ben in his car, his face a mask of terror, pointing at the void. You have to see it, man. You have to look. He saw Sarah Jennings, Arthur, all the victims, their faces contorted, their spectral forms all pointing at the shimmering distortion, their silent voices joining the chorus. It was a trap of empathy, a weaponization of his own guilt. The temptation to look, to truly see the source of all this pain, was a physical force, pulling his gaze toward it. But he remembered Arthur's warning, the one piece of advice that felt like a lifeline, regardless of the motive behind it. You must not. You must look through it. Focus only on the camera. He fought against the psychic pull, his muscles trembling with the strain. He refused to look at the void. Instead, he forced his eyes to find the small, blinking red light on the remote trigger in his hand. That tiny, insignificant light became his entire world. It was his anchor. He was an observer, yes, but he could choose his subject. He would not observe the monster. He would observe the process. He would observe the trap he was about to spring. With a final desperate surge of will, Eli squeezed the button on the remote. There was no sound. There was no click. There was only light. A silent, impossible explosion of pure, white light erupted not from the camera, but from everywhere at once. It was a 360-degree flash that bleached the world of all color and shadow for a single eternal moment. It was not a light you saw with your eyes. It was a light you felt in your bones. A soundless, concussive wave of energy blasted outward from the tripod, throwing Eli backward off his feet. He landed hard on the damp earth, the air driven from his lungs. The world snapped back into color, the sounds of the night rushing back in. He looked up, his vision swimming. The shimmering void was gone. The air was just air again. The tripod was a mangled wreck of twisted metal, the spherical camera shattered into 1,000 pieces, its twin lenses like clouded, broken eyes. The plan had worked. Or it had failed spectacularly. Then he saw it. Lying on the grass a few feet from the wreckage was the small black memory card. It was glowing with a faint, internal, pulsing red light like a dying ember. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his back, and snatched the card from the ground. It was warm to the touch. He didn't wait to see if the entity would return. He turned and ran, not looking back, a small, warm rectangle clutched in his fist. He had his picture. Now he just had to survive long enough to look at it. Eli ran until his lungs burned and the adrenaline gave way to a bone-deep exhaustion. He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't go back to his apartment. There was only one place left. He found himself on the doorstep of a 24-hour photo lab in a dingy part of town, a place he hadn't visited in years. It was owned by a man named Leo, a grizzled old photojournalist who had mentored Eli in his early days. Their relationship had soured when Eli chose the sterile, objective world of forensics over the messy, human world of journalism, but a fragile thread of respect remained. Leo opened the door, his face etched with surprise that quickly curdled into concern. He took in Eli's wild eyes, his disheveled clothes, and the frantic way he clutched the small memory card to his chest. "Eli, what the hell happened to you?" "I need your help, Leo," Eli rasped, his voice raw. "I need your best machine, and I need you to lock the door behind me." Leo stared at him for a long moment, then sighed and stepped aside. "Whatever you're running from, kid, don't bring it in here." But Eli knew it was too late. He was already carrying it in the palm of his hand. The lab was a high-tech version of Eli's own darkroom. He slid the memory card, which had finally stopped glowing, into the reader of a state-of-the-art workstation. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely guide it into the slot. The machine whirred, recognizing the card. A single file appeared on the screen. The file name was a chaotic jumble of unreadable symbols, and its size was impossibly large, gigabytes of data from a single shot. He clicked to open it. The screen went black for a moment, and then the image loaded. It was a mess. A distorted, warped, 360-degree panoramic image of the park at dusk. The perspective was nauseating. The horizon bent into a perfect circle. The colors were oversaturated and bleeding into one another, and the entire image was overlaid with a shimmering, digital noise, like a corrupted video file. It looked like nothing. It was a failed photograph, a digital scream. Disappointment, cold and bitter, washed over him. Arthur had lied. The camera had been destroyed. The flash had done nothing. It was all for nothing. But then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the static. He leaned closer, his eyes scanning the chaotic image. The digital noise wasn't random. It was swirling, coalescing, like iron filings around a magnet. And at the center of the warped image, where the shimmering void had been, the distortion was at its most intense. He was looking at the entity's wound, a scar left on the fabric of the photograph itself. "You're looking at it wrong," he muttered to himself, the old instincts taking over. "You never look at the raw image." His hands flew across the keyboard, his movements sure and practiced. He wasn't a terrified man anymore. He was a photographer at work. He ran noise reduction filters. He adjusted the white balance. He desaturated the garish colors, plunging the world of the park into stark shades of gray. The image became clearer, but still revealed nothing. "The truth is in the shadows," he whispered, reciting an old darkroom maxim. He opened the levels palette and inverted the image, turning it into a photographic negative. And the world turned inside out. Black became white, light became dark. And the hidden details, the ones lurking in the negative space, screamed into existence. The trees, the grass, the sky, they were no longer just scenery. They were made of faces. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps. Pale, screaming faces, their features twisted in agony, were woven into the very fabric of the park. A face in the bark of the old oak tree, A pair of eyes in a patch of clouds. A silent mouth in the blades of grass. It was a tapestry of the damned. He saw the face of the financier, Alistair Finch. He saw Sarah Jennings. He saw Ben, his mouth open in the same screen from the dashboard camera. He saw them all, the observers. He stared, his mind refusing to process the horror. This wasn't a photograph of a park. It was a photograph of a prison. The gaze wasn't a killer. It was a collector. He felt a sudden, horrifying impulse to zoom in on one of the faces. He chose his sister. He found her image woven into the leaves of a small bush near the center of the frame. Her face was pale, her mouth open in a silent scream, just like the others. But as he watched, the image moved. Her head slowly turned on the screen, her digital eyes locking directly onto his. The expression of terror melted away, replaced by a look of cold, hollow, and utterly damning accusation. The accusation in Maya's eyes was a key, unlocking the final terrible doors in his mind. He finally understood Arthur's betrayal. The old man hadn't been giving him a weapon to destroy the entity. He was giving the entity a weapon to capture him. The 360-degree camera wasn't for destroying the prison. It was for building a new cell. He thought of the photo at Arthur's house, the old man's terrified eyes. Arthur hadn't escaped. He had made a deal. He had offered the entity a trade, a new, more powerful observer in exchange for his own release. His blindness wasn't a scar. It was his freedom. The ultimate truth crashed down on Eli with the force of a physical blow. The gaze, his ancient, parasitic consciousness, was tired. It had been the warden for centuries, perhaps millennia. It didn't want to possess him. It wanted to retire. It wanted him to take its place, to become the new gaze, the new warden of this screaming, silent prison of souls, tethered to the world by the act of observation itself. That was the entity's endgame. Not consumption, but succession. As this realization settled, he caught his own reflection in the dark screen of the monitor, and his heart stopped. His face was fading. It was like a photographic image left too long in the sun, the details slowly bleaching away. The lines around his eyes, the scar on his chin, the color of his irises, they were becoming translucent, indistinct. He raised a hand to his face, and in the reflection, his hand passed right through it. The entity's offer was no longer an invitation. Now that he understood, it was a command, a psychic pull on his very essence, drawing him out of his body and into the prison of the photograph. He was becoming a ghost. He was being erased. The erasure was not painful. It was a gentle, terrifying dissolution. Eli watched his reflection on the dark monitor become smoke, his substance thinning, the psychic pull of the photograph drawing him in like a tide. He was a photograph himself, overexposed and fading to white. The entity flooded his mind, no longer with threats, but with promises. It showed him visions born from his own desires. He saw himself standing in the timeline of the city, seeing the threads of crimes before they were committed. He saw a mugging and prevented it. He saw a fire and guided the family to safety. He saw every secret, every lie, every hidden truth. It was a promise of ultimate knowledge, of the power to impose order on a chaotic world, the power of the perfect observer. Then it showed him the one thing that could break him. It showed him the park, not as a place of horror, but as it was on that sunny afternoon. And Maya was there, running toward him, her gap-toothed smile bright and real. She took his hand. "It's okay, Eli," her voice echoed in his mind, a perfect, loving recreation. "We can be together now. No one has to be alone anymore. All you have to do is look." To be with her again, to undo the mistake that had defined his entire life. The temptation was an ocean, and he was drowning. He felt his will dissolving, his essence ready to pour into the digital prison. He was on the brink. His own face in the reflection was almost entirely gone. He was ready to let go. Then on the monitor, the image of his sister, the one with the cold, accusing eyes, changed one last time. The accusation vanished, replaced by a look of raw, desperate pleading. A new thought, clear and sharp and distinctly hers, cut through the entity's siren song. Don't. The single word was a shard of ice in the warm ocean of temptation. Don't erase us. The truth, the final, most monstrous layer of the trap, revealed itself. Destroying the photograph, the prison, wouldn't set the souls free. Their tormented consciousness was bound to the data on the memory card. To destroy the data would be to annihilate them completely, to erase every last trace of them from existence. Their prison was the only thing keeping them real. Eli was faced with the entity's true, impossible choice. Accept the trade. Become the new gaze, a timeless, monstrous warden, and in doing so, preserve the souls of his sister and countless others in their eternal, screaming torment. Destroy the photograph. Save himself. Walk away free, but commit an act of cosmic murder, erasing his sister from the universe forever to spare her the pain. Both paths led to damnation, one for him, one for her. Arthur's plan, the entity's plan, had been perfect. Eli, what the hell is going on in there? Open this door. Leo's voice, muffled but real, slammed into the psychic battle raging in Eli's mind. The pounding on the locked door was a lifeline, a reminder of the real world, of consequences, of a reality outside the entity's carefully constructed dilemma. He looked from his fading reflection to the tapestry of screaming faces on the screen. He looked at Maya's pleading, trapped eyes. He understood. The entity's power, the prison's very existence, was predicated on one thing: observation. The prison needed a warden. The souls needed to be seen. If he accepted, he became the warden. If he destroyed the photo to save himself, he would be forever haunted by the observation of his own memory, his own guilt. Both choices fed the cycle. He needed a third option, not to choose, but to refuse the choice entirely. His reflection on the screen began to solidify, his features snapping back into focus as a new, terrible resolve hardened within him. The psychic pull faltered, confused by this unexpected resistance. He was no longer a victim being pulled in. He was a force pushing back. With a roar of effort, Eli shoved himself away from the desk. He looked directly at the monitor, at the entire, horrifying panorama of souls. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He let the full weight of their agony, their terror, and their despair wash over him. He met Maya's eyes, and in his mind, he whispered, "I'm sorry." He grabbed the heaviest object he could find, a solid steel paper cutter bolted to a heavy wooden base. He ripped it free with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. Leo finally kicked the door open, stumbling into the room. "Eli, stop!" But Eli didn't smash the monitor. That was just a window. He raised the cutter high and brought it down on the computer tower, the brains of the operation. He smashed it again and again, plastic and metal crunching, sparks flying, until the machine was a mangled wreck. The psychic pressure lessened, but it was still there, tethered to its source, the memory card. Eli walked past the stunned Leo, his movements calm and deliberate. He ejected the card from the shattered reader. He held it in his palm, the small black square that contained a universe of pain. He walked over to the chemical baths. Developer, stop bath, fixer. The fixer was a bath of ammonium thiosulfate, a chemical designed to make images permanent, but brutally corrosive to anything else. It was a fitting end. He held the card over the tray of clear liquid. He looked at Leo, his eyes conveying a universe of horror and apology. Then he dropped the card. It hit the surface with a faint hiss. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the plastic began to bubble and warp. The delicate gold contacts on the chip curled and blackened. A silent, psychic scream. A wave of pure, unadulterated agony and release. tore through the room, so powerful that Leo cried out and clutched his head. Eli felt it as a physical blow, staggering back, but he did not look away. He watched as the card, the prison, the last vestiges of hundreds of souls dissolved into nothing. Then silence. The pressure in his head was gone. The weight on his soul was gone. The faces in his mind were gone. There was only the quiet hum of the lab's ventilation and the sharp, chemical smell of the fixer. He stood there, in the wreckage of the lab and his life, breathing freely for the first time in 15 years. He hadn't saved Maya. He had done the only merciful thing he could. He had let her go. He hadn't looked away. He had watched until the very end, and in doing so, had granted them the peace of oblivion over the torture of existence. The gaze was blind. The prison was empty. He was free.